Ave Maria in the Afternoon is a co-production of Ave Maria Radio and EWTN Radio and carried across the EWTN Global Catholic Radio Network. Welcome to Ave Maria in the Afternoon, examining the world through the lens of faith from the heart of the Church to help us navigate the culture. Here's Dr. Marcus Peter.
Good afternoon, and thank you for joining us on this hour of Ave Maria in the Afternoon. I'm Marcus Peter. President Donald Trump has already issued several executive orders addressing matters from gender to climate change to immigration. We're going to talk about some of these things with Andrea Picciotti-Bayer, who joins us every week. She's a legal analyst for EWTN News, director of the Conscience Project. You can follow her work on Twitter at Bayer Picciotti, and also visit conscienceproject.org, conscience-project.org. And the reason why we want to recap his executive orders is because the United States bishops have issued certain statements pertaining to some of the executive orders that have been signed. The United States Conference on Wednesday issued a public criticism of some of President Donald Trump's initial executive orders. Now, these are pertaining to some key issues that the Catholic Church has concern about. These include immigration, capital punishment, and they're concerned and warning that some of these executive orders could cause harm to be done to the most vulnerable among us. There's a certain room here. There's a certain amount of room here for prudential judgment and therefore the exercise of moral reasoning pertaining to these issues. We have to be careful in ascribing complete blame or ascribing complete moral impunity to President Trump and the executive orders that have been placed. So not only do we have to talk about it, we can discern well based on objectively what the Church teaches. And we don't necessarily have to agree with all of the statements of either President Trump or the USCCB, but we have to agree with what the Magisterium teaches and what the Magisterium calls us to stand on. So regarding the executive order on biological sex, for example, Archbishop Broglio expressed agreement with Donald Trump. Other provisions in the executive order have a more positive light, recognizing the truth of each human person as male and female. So there are certain objective things that we can celebrate. We move on from there to the maturity of the exposition of the Psalms. Among St. Augustine's many contributions to the faith is his wondrous exposition of the Psalms. And we take a look at this with Mary McDonald, who is the director of the Writing Center and Writing Across the Curriculum program at Cleveland State University. We extrapolate the brilliance of St. Augustine and how you and I can learn from his exposition in terms of understanding the Psalms and praying them well in our own life. And so we have all of this after the headlines.
Thanks, Marcus. Good afternoon, everyone. This is your Ave Maria Radio News for Wednesday, January 22nd. It's the Feast of St. Vincent Pallotti. Today's news brought to you by Visiting Angels, providing loving care and assistance for seniors in need at visitingangels.com. President Trump has declared a national emergency at the southern border. The Pentagon is sending an additional 1,500 active-duty troops to the border. And while that may sound scary to some, it's music to the ears of law enforcement.
The morale right now is at an all-time high. I think now that we know that we have a strong ally at the federal level, which is something that we have not had in the last 4 years.
Lieutenant Chris Oliveras with the Texas State Troopers say they felt handcuffed by the last administration, which he says put a priority on asylum over stopping illegal immigration. President Trump used executive orders to label cartels as terrorist organizations, which gives authorities more tools to deal with them. U.S. Senator Alex Padilla says President Trump is in for a fight if he takes a hard line on immigration in California.
If it's a battle that President Trump wants and the battle that he's going to get from California.
Padilla says California is the most diverse state in the nation and home to more immigrants than any other state. He says the vast majority of immigrants living in California have been doing so for years, working, paying taxes, and raising families. Cardinal Christoph Schönborn is retired as Archbishop of Vienna, Austria, upon reaching his 80th birthday. He led Austria's most populous archdiocese of 3 decades and has also helped write the Catechism of the Catholic Church. He's currently the chairman of Pope Francis's Council of Cardinals. Pope Francis accepting Schönborn's resignation and appointed an apostolic administrator to oversee the archdiocese until a successor is named. And the American Red Cross is asking people to schedule appointments as winter storms and California wildfires have led to thousands of cancellations. Donors are asked to book a time to give blood or platelets by using the Red Cross Blood Donor app or calling 1-800-RED-CROSS. Those who give through January 26 will be automatically entered for a chance to win a trip for 2 tickets to the Super Bowl in New Orleans. From your AveMariaRadio.net news desk, I'm Steve Clark.
Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Feter. President Donald Trump has already issued several executive orders addressing matters from gender to climate change to immigration. We review some of these with our friend Andrea Picciotti-Bayer, who is legal analyst for EWTN News and director of the Conscience Project. You can follow her work at conscience-project.org. Andrea, so great to speak with you. How are you?
Oh, Marcus, thank you so much. I feel like we're kind of drinking from the fire hose these last few days, but it's very exciting.
There really is a lot to talk about. And I know the United States, the USCCB, I know they've issued statements expressing certain concern. And we want to assuage the concern of many of our listeners here that the concerns of the USCCB are based on prudential judgment and they're therefore not objective moral pronunciations of evil on the part of Donald Trump.
No, I think you're right. I mean, but there is an issue and a serious issue with regard to, some of the executive orders that I think we need to really celebrate related to just the kind of truth of biological reality.
Yep.
And that's something that I think that the USCCB and several bishops have stated even before this executive order, that particular executive order, basically erasing gender biology from the federal government. But there is an issue about the logistics of securing our border and places of worship. I'm particularly concerned about, the sanctity of our houses of worship and not pitting the church against the legitimate authority of the government in regulating our borders. So I'm hopeful that the parties are going to come to the table and instead of in a posture of divisiveness and antagonism, we'll really try to figure out how we can stabilize the situation soon.
Right, because we do have to acknowledge that we have a kind of immigration crisis, especially when it comes to illegal immigration, and the answer to that needs to be prudently discerned. And the USCCB rightly has concerns about mass deportations, but deportation by itself is not an objective evil, especially when it's in light of the violation of the laws of the land. So you're right, the church has a voice here in terms of respecting the dignity of the human person.
No, and again, with regard to immigration, I mean, I think that the church has always been kind of clear of the right of nations to secure their border and have a regulated and orderly immigration process. And that's one issue. There is, just a little asterisk that I think we just need to be mindful of, that just like it was profoundly dangerous that the Biden administration was suggesting law enforcement go into our churches to root out, quote unquote, terrorists.
Yep.
We need to be mindful that we can't let that happen with regard to the immigration issue either, right? And instead, churches and law enforcement need to be working collaboratively, and that in general, the general principle of houses of worship being kind of a safe place.
Right.
It's where
Sanctuary.
people have, yes, and that we respect that. So, I don't think that these are unworkable steps forward. I think that we just need to be very, like you mentioned before, prudential judgment, reasonable relations, and a willingness for everyone to come to the table, both to protect our churches and to respect the lawful authority of the government with regard to immigration.
Yep. And that honestly is the morally sound position to hold. And thank God that this is the stance of the church. And so we'll keep praying that kind of collaboration continues to take place. I want to pivot a little in terms of what you said is a cause for celebration, which undoubtedly every Catholic reading these terms in those executive orders celebrate, which is the affirmation of the binary reality of the sexes and therefore the return of quote-unquote biological truth to the federal government.
No, I think it's a huge shift. And a very important one. I mean, the gender ideology is all about confusion and we're finding that there's some clarity that the church has maintained kind of clear vision of human reality, while at the same time recognizing that there are people afflicted by gender dysphoria and they need to be cared for, not kept in their confusion, but cared for. And it seems like the federal government seems to be echoing that same concern, as opposed to what we saw in the prior administration, which was basically to promote, celebrate, and foment and almost regulate confusion, whether it be in the classroom or the workplace. So this is a huge shift, very important. I think that there were, incredible leaders, Catholic leaders, involved in helping to make sure that the language was strong and clear. But as we know, an executive order is a directive, and the administrative state, unfortunately, has been seeped in gender ideology, and so it's going to take some time. And undoing what has been done over the last 4 years is going to take some really hard work. And for those of us that are listening, we really just need to pray for the people that are going to be working on looking at how deep this ideology seeped into rules, regulations, and the way that our government was operating.
And that's a crucial point to bring up, Andrea. I'm really glad you mentioned that, because you and I have talked about this, that a big thrust of the former presidency was, in fact, the pushing of gender ideology, as if it is an objective fact that has to become the new recognition of the land, let alone the law of the land. And so this move from President Trump and this new administration is a stark reversal of what we've encountered the past 4 years.
Yeah, no, absolutely. And I think it's going to play out not only in just what the federal government is promoting, but what it can do in kind of ancillary conflicts. And I think about, in particular, a lot of these issues of gender ideology are in our judiciary.
Right.
And whether the federal government was the lead on it or was taking the side of those that were promoting it, we really see that now the Department of Justice, the Solicitor General's office, for cases that are in the Supreme Court, really can take a forward-looking and different perspective. And I think that that's going to be of great assistance to our courts.
Yep, I couldn't agree more. And just to put a neat little pin on that discussion, it's also going to reaffirm the necessity of protecting women in women's sports and women's locker rooms, and the list can go on ultimately. And so the recognition of the binary reality of the sexes is going to benefit women at the national level.
No, heck yeah. And men. I mean, I think that we've got to see this not only as far as preserving the aspirations of Title IX for women and girls in education and in sports, but also just it's good for society. It's good for kind of an ordered and healthy relationship between men and women. So, I as a woman, as a mother, I'm very happy about this, but I think that all people of goodwill should be happy for this return to, biological reality and sanity.
So as we close off this segment and move on to the next one after the break, what are some of the other executive orders that we ought to be paying attention to?
I think that there are things that are going to be coming out. I mean, it's almost like the litany of executive orders is really shows how entrenched the administrative state is and how much work needed to be done. I'm anticipating that there be movement, especially continued movement on issues promoting life and the sanctity of life, and I think that we should be looking towards that. I would love to see the reinstatement of what was known as the Mexico City policy, where the federal government made a commitment to not use federal international investment for the promotion of abortion. And I think that's hopefully something that we can see coming in the next few days.
Yep, and I'd like to address that on the other side of the break, but especially in light of the March for Life coming up this Friday. We are talking with my friend Andrea Picciotti-Bayer, legal analyst for EWTN News, director of the Conscience Project. We're talking about the Catholic response to the numerous executive orders that have been recently signed by the newly inaugurated President Donald Trump. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
Do you own popular index mutual funds or ETFs? If so, you're automatically own shares of companies that conflict with your moral beliefs. Ave Maria mutual funds are managed to conform to pro-life and pro-family values. Long-term investors can invest in the no-load Ave Maria mutual funds. The experienced professional portfolio managers make decisions based on investment fundamentals and pro-life values. You can learn more about Ave Maria mutual funds today at 866-AVE-MARIA or visit AveMariaFunds.com. We are the pro-life generation, passionate about building the culture of life in our healthcare and in our nation. But not all healthcare options are equally pro-life, and some provide morally objectionable procedures. CMF Curo is different. CMF Curo is a pro-life Catholic healthcare ministry providing a pathway for its members to build the culture of life in their healthcare choices, not destroy it. Learn more about CMF Curo at mycatholichealthcare.com. That's mycatholichealthcare.com. This program brought to you in part by the town of Ave Maria, Florida.
Ave Maria, a big kind of small town. A golf cart friendly, ride your bike everywhere kind of town with something for everyone. Resort style amenities, 2 golf courses, shopping, and dining in our town center. With Ave Maria University and Ave Maria Catholic Church at the core of the community and a wide range of homes to meet your family's needs. Visitors are welcome. More information can be found at AveMaria.com. Ave Maria, a big kind of small town.
Ave Maria in the Afternoon is underwritten by the following nonprofit organization: Real Estate for Life. Buying or selling your home or business property? Real Estate for Life can connect you with one of 1,400 pro-life real estate agents around the world. When Real Estate for Life receives a referral fee, they donate 70% to Ave Maria Radio and Human Life International. More information at realestateforlife.org or 877-LIFE-US1. That's realestateforlife.org.
Good afternoon. Welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. My guest, Andrea Picciotti-Bayer, legal analyst for EWTN News, director of the Conscience Project, and we are talking about the Catholic assessment of the executive orders as we have seen them signed by the newly inaugurated President Trump. So, Andrea, we left off on the other side of the break earlier, and I just wanted to touch on this. In 2020, January of 2020, President Trump made some very clear pro-life statements at the March for Life. We haven't seen that kind of rhetoric come from his campaign this time around. But pro-lifers are definitely more hopeful with this presidency than we would have been had his political opponents won.
No, I think that's absolutely correct. I'm a little disappointed that the president won't be at the March for Life in Washington, D.C. His schedule has him, I believe, going to California. But, all indications are that the collaborative relationship that the president had with the pro-life leaders will continue. There's a lot to be done. Who would have thought that Roe versus Wade would have been overturned? And I think that this is where everyone's got to just be ready to roll up their sleeves and continue to march forward to make sure that a respect for the states is there and that we really are working more at the grassroots level. But it sure is comforting to know that at the federal level, there is a reaffirmation of the sanctity of life and the vulnerability and a commitment to help the vulnerability of women that are pregnant without the supports that they need. We mentioned before both, the concerns about those that are abroad, but I also think that there's serious concerns about helping women here at home to be able to know that life is the choice that they should be making.
Given that, like you mentioned, between the choices that we should be making, but also for those of us who we have certain disappointments about some of the executive orders in terms of we didn't see anything pertaining to the overturning of the Mexico City policy or the preservation of the Hyde Amendment prohibition. So are those things that you suspect will be visible in the future? He could well be waiting for Friday to do certain things.
Yeah, I mean, he really could, and that's something that we can pray for. I mean, our Lord likes to be asked, so we could
That's right.
pray for it. Today, of course, is the anniversary of Roe versus Wade. It would be great if we can get some formalized pardons for those who have been incarcerated for protests in front of clinics. But, I think that the main thing that we need to do is don't read anything into the absence of action. Be ready to continue to push for action. So,
Right.
it used to be that people would look at a president's first year, and then they looked at a president's first 100 days. And now we're like, what happened on day one? So maybe we need to give a little bit of grace to this new administration. Be thankful for the steps that have been taken. They're very, very significant ones.
Yep.
And at the same time, be ready to continue to push on issues that are of concern for Catholics and that we know advance the common good.
Yep, and push we must. That I think that is a very reasonable, strong exhortation that we haven't won the fight. This is just an avenue of hope for us, and the fight won't be over until life is completely honored from natural conception to natural death. Speaking of natural death, Trump's executive order calling for the expansive use of the death penalty, that has incurred some concern at the level of the USCCB.
Yeah, I was a very young lawyer and clerking for federal judges at the appellate level, and the issues of the death penalty really become mired down in a lot of legal wrangling.
Right.
And that I personally saw that oftentimes instead of being a deterrent, it just prolonged a lot of suffering. So there's some issues related to just kind of whether the benefits of the death penalty are actually there for deterrence and for kind of the exacting punishment on grave offenses. I do think that this is a conversation to be had. There is underlying the church's concern are some of those issues, right?
Right.
Kind of more practical, modern day concerns that Pope Francis has raised.
Yep.
So, I tend to think that, we need to be very serious and prayerful about this. And it is a bit of a shocker, but I think it's very consistent with President Trump's very strong, iron-fisted rule,
right.
Leadership. So it shouldn't be that surprising. At the same time, we need to be mindful that there may be instances in which the death penalty is either not appropriate, and that's where the church's voice and request for leniency or for pardons comes in.
Right. And we know where the Church's objective perennial teaching stands on the question, but we also know where Pope Francis has been wanting to lead the Church in terms of the application of that prudential judgment. So, like you said, this is a conversation that needs to continue to be had between the United States bishops and the present administration. So, in terms of the climate, what are some things that we ought to, and executive orders pertaining to climate, what are some things we ought to be aware of?
It's funny that you say the climate. I'm here in Washington, D.C., and it's cold. It's very cold. I again, the decision to pull out of things like the different international associations, again, I think that those are ones that, are within the authority of the executive. I think that it doesn't mean, and we need to be very mindful that it doesn't mean that when we pull out of these accords that we're not continuing to be serious about our stewardship
right.
over the earth. And that's something that is, we've seen, for example, Robert Kennedy Jr. is, most of his life was really dedicated to issues of conservation and good stewardship. It continues to be something that I believe that Catholics should be mindful. We are called to use the resources that God has given us well. And it doesn't mean that we are, absolutely reactionary, or it shouldn't be cause for us to think that people shouldn't have babies. But it just means that we need to model good behavior, and the church, and I think the Pope has written on this extensively, of the responsibility that we have, both individually and collectively. And so pulling out of what, he may have concluded are dysfunctional alliances, that's, totally within his authority. At the same time, I think we need to continue to just be very mature in saying we cannot be a wasteful community.
Yes.
And that's something serious, and that's something that the church, we teach in our own homes, right? We don't just buy and purchase and throw away. So that's modeling good behavior right now might be the most effective role that all of us can give.
Yep. And I couldn't agree more. And as we close off this segment, Andrea, just very quickly, Montgomery County, the parents asking the Supreme Court to secure their right to protect children from public school curriculum pertaining to gender ideology.
Yeah, Marcus, we have spoken a lot about this, and I feel like I'm, continuing to ring this bell. I think it's a key case. Just to remind your listeners, this was an issue where a group of parents of different faith traditions asked for their right to opt their children out of exposure of a collection of storybooks that is really sexually explicit. Their local school board in Montgomery County, Maryland, said, no, you don't have that right, even though you could opt your children out of sex ed, for example. They brought their case to the district court, lost, to the Fourth Circuit, lost, and now they're before the Supreme Court. So this is something we'll be talking about in the future. It's a great sign, and I really would love the Trump administration to support the parents in this case.
Yep, and I believe, given what we've seen so far, that's probably going to happen. Andrea, thank you for joining us.
Thanks, Marcus. Have a good evening.
You too. My guest, Andrea Picciotti-Bayer, legal analyst for EWTN News. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
Steve Ray here. Next year's a Jubilee year, and we're going to celebrate it in Rome. But not only Rome. This is our Saints and Shrines of Italy pilgrimage, and joining us is our good friend Teresa Tomeo.
Yes, Steve, fantastical. Walking through the holy doors, immersing ourselves in the deeply Catholic culture of Italy. I'll be joining you and Janet in Florence and Assisi.
Join us this May for the Jubilee year, from Milan to Florence and much more, all the way to Rome.
Find the Ave Maria Radio travel tab at AveMariaRadio.net.
Support for this Ave Maria radio program comes in part by the non-for-profit St. Anthony Services. Are you shopping for mortgage products, Catholic investing, Catholic health, real estate, or estate planning? StAnthonyServices.org can help you find a Catholic professional for these needs. They regularly connect faithful citizens with faith-based professionals that share our Christian values. More information at StAnthonyServices.org or 877-LIFE-US1.
When your children consider going to college, where are you going to find a place that will prepare them for the future and build on the foundation that you've laid? The answer? Ave Maria University. With an authentically Catholic curriculum, including 35 majors, AMU prepares students to take on the world.
My daughter told me she was published in a scientific journal as an undergrad. I'm so proud of her. The world needs Catholic physicists, and my daughter's going to be one of them.
Learn more at avemaria.edu. That's avemaria.edu.
Underwritten in part by the following nonprofit.
Are you paying high prices with a traditional health insurance company that pays for things that violate your conscience? There's an alternative available. Solidarity HealthShare is a community of faithful individuals and families that never share into immoral medical services, all while saving you money with prices starting as low as $85 per month for singles and $512 for families. Never fund another abortion with your healthcare dollars. Call 844-313-4999 to learn more.
Teaches that Jesus Christ is literally and wholly present, body and blood, soul and divinity, under the appearances of bread and wine. In the Bread of Life discourse documented in John chapter 6, Jesus states that he is the bread of life, and that his flesh is true food and his blood true drink. The Jews were scandalized in verse 52. How can this man give us his flesh to eat? Jesus does not back down, but reiterates this teaching 4 more times over the next 4 verses. Many left in verse 66 because this teaching was truly difficult. But at no point does Jesus water down his teaching and call them back. No, he allows them to leave, and even questions his 12 apostles if they too wish to leave. Jesus intended to be understood literally, and the Jews, apostles, and the Catholic Church absolutely take him at his word. Examining the truth of the Catholic faith, this is faithforensics.org.
What makes you happy? Truly and completely happy? Not just for a day or a year. What makes you truly, completely happy day in, year out? St. Thomas Aquinas says, God alone satisfies. Each and every one of us in the human race desire happiness. Our Creator, God, implanted that desire in our spiritual DNA so that we would be drawn to Him alone who can completely fulfill that desire. The Beatitudes respond to that yearning for happiness, says the Catechism of the Catholic Church, because they reveal the ultimate end of human acts. God calls us to His own beatitude, characterized variously as the coming of the kingdom of God, the vision of God, the joy of the Lord, or entering into God's rest. This is Peggy Stanton, and this has been the Order of Malta's Minute with the Catechism.
Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. Among St. Augustine's many contributions to the faith is his exposition of the Psalms, which is invaluable in its insights. We take a look at them with Mary McDonald, who directs the Writing Center and Writing Across the Curriculum program at Cleveland State University. She is the author of The Maturity of the Expositions of the Psalms, found on New Oxford Review. Mary, thank you for joining us on the program.
Hi, thank you.
So, how long have you had this interest in studying the works of Augustine, especially from a literary perspective?
Oh, about 8 years.
So, in your appreciation of Augustine over these years, what are some of the insights that you found in his exposition of the Psalms?
Oh, for me, probably the most stunning part of it is what is called the totus Christus. In other words, the whole Christ. So Augustine has this synthetic ability to pull all the different roles of Christ together. And for me, I felt like I learned so much about seeing Christ in such a complex and all together, the same thing pulled together is magnificent. The other thing that I love is it is a wisdom text. In other words, it's a book that is trying to teach us about the love of Christ and God and neighbor.
Right.
And so as a wisdom text, it approaches your heart. And so I found that it was applicable and just such a conversational and witty book, even though the downside is it's 6 volumes, and there's so much.
The downside is that it's 6 volumes. I hear you. It's a copious work, but it's well worth diving into. I remember my initial foray into Augustine involved reading excerpts of the exposition of the Psalms, and he writes with a true poetic flair. He's got this great capacity of appreciating the sublime divinity of God while engaging in the depths of human passions.
Oh, yeah, absolutely.
So, in your reading of him, in your research of him, what are some of the brilliant insights you found in terms of his merging of this, this divine elevation of God with the reality of human nature coming to encounter God?
I think that for me, I think my background, and I think a lot of Christians would agree that we don't get enough of this holistic picture of Jesus. In other words, you see images of Christ too feminine, nothing against correctives. In other words, it's okay to have a corrective. But that a singular kind of Jesus as my friend, or Jesus as my Savior or Jesus as, God. These are separate things, and I never saw them all pulled together like Augustine does. And for me, that was a really magnificent part of this book. Other insights I had were that it was such a fascinating counterpose to the Confessions.
Right.
So most people know the Confessions. I think there's not enough buses to throw Augustine under in our culture. In other words, many people get so mad at Augustine. And I think that the Confessions are a chance to analyze sin, to say, this is why I did this is what I was doing, this is why it was wrong, in Technicolor, right, in the Confessions. But once we get to Augustine as a bishop in the last 20 years of his life, we see this marvelous shift over to saying something like this: sweep the bedroom of your heart. Because what we want is this idea that conscience, the ability to look into one's heart, is how you're going to move toward what God wants you to do and to love others more. And so this idea of moving from this radical, this is what I did wrong, and I just would love to throw in a hilarious thing here. When I was younger, I would ask my mom about confession, like, how come you're not going to confession? She would say, I haven't robbed any banks lately. And I kind of was taken back with it. I was like, what? And then later I learned that in the early Christian church, it was always public sin that was considered really serious, murder and theft and adultery, right? So I get where my mom was coming from. But what Augustine's doing as a contemplative is saying that your heart has to be directed at God. Like most contemplatives would tell you that, that your heart has to be looking at God. And what he's doing is writing as a contemplative at the end of his life. And he's shepherding as a bishop. Right. And he's doing with this most incredible, rhetoric and stylistic prose that is making us think. And that's what we want, is the heart's thinking, the mind's thinking, and it's moving us to do things that will land us in a place where we're kind to our neighbor, we're kind to our enemies, we're growing to be more Christ-like.
Right. So he took 20 years to write the exposition. So you just talked about growing, and it's very clear that if you read the expositions as you have, you're going to pick up on the reality that there's a maturation and depth that he himself grows into. So share with us about that.
Yes. I think that's one of the more fascinating things is you see him in a role of bishop. And I think Michael Cameron, the scholar Michael Cameron, he's so good about saying that as a bishop, Augustine is caring for his flock. And so this is this tremendously caring writer at this point. So in other words, there's such a shift again from the Confessions where, Augustine is just laying it out for us, what he did wrong, why he did wrong, the horror of the whole thing. And now the maturation is one where he's really trying to explain to everybody, how to move into this more spiritual experience. And I mean, sometimes you can see people getting angry, like, hey, wait a minute. We've had a century of the Confession, and we haven't had enough of the expositions, okay. But I think that this, again, is a model for us. It's a model for when we think about maturity, what that really means in that, like loving our enemies, like he's saying, swallow your enemies so that you begin to, like if you do that, you have somebody in your life and you say, boy, this person's really driving me nuts. And you say, I'm going to imagine in my mind, I'm swallowing this person. Then what happens is you usually key into the motivation, why, what it is they want. And Augustine's saying that if you allow your enemy to make you be like them, that's really the work of an enemy, that you can't become like them. That's the problem, So in other words, that's a real mark of maturity, to be able to really love one's enemy, take them in, love that enemy, and then pray, what are you going to do in response to whatever it is, That, and then I think the other thing is this tremendous emphasis on peace, and peace as the voice of God. In other words, that God calling us to peace. And I think people don't really always think like that, that so many people are, how can I put it? They're either afraid of God in the wrong way. I mean, I'm a big proponent that everyone should be terrified of God. I think too little fear of God.
Right, proper fear of the Lord, yeah.
Right. But I think that Augustine is looking at, the voice of God is peace, and it calls to peace. And so that Augustine is, the maturation in the expositions is to move interior peace and exterior peace.
Thank you so much, Mary. We are continuing this conversation with Mary McDonald, who is the director of the Writing Center and Writing Across the Curriculum program at Cleveland State University. We're talking about what you and I can learn today from St. Augustine's exposition on the Psalms. Stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.
When your children consider going to college, where are you going to find a place that will prepare them for the future and build on the foundation that you've laid? The answer? Ave Maria University. With an authentically Catholic curriculum, including 35 majors, AMU prepares students to take on the world.
I've seen the difference in my son since he's been at Ave Maria. He's happy, he's excited about what he's going to do with his degree, and he's living his faith.
Learn more at avemaria.edu. That's avemaria.edu. Ave Maria School of Law is the Roman Catholic law school in the United States. Consistently ranked in the Princeton Review as one of the best and most conservative law schools, as well as pre-law's most devout law school. Ave Maria School of Law provides a traditional legal education while emphasizing how the law intersects with the Catholic intellectual tradition and natural law philosophy. Ave Maria School of Law, unabashedly Catholic, consistently excellent. For more information, visit avemarialaw.edu.
Ave Maria in the Afternoon is underwritten by the following nonprofit organization: Real Estate for Life. Buying or selling your home or business property? Real Estate for Life can connect you with one of 1,400 pro-life real estate agents around the world. When Real Estate for Life receives a referral fee, they donate 70% to Ave Maria Radio and Human Life International. More information at realestateforlife.org or 877-LIFE-US1. That's realestateforlife.org.
St. Therese once told her sister Celine that when we trust ourselves and not God, our soul becomes barren and incapable of virtue. Her remedy? External works of charity. We all try to do it on our own sometimes without asking for God's help. At St. Paul Evangelization, we suggest sharing the gospel with someone who needs it. Check out streetevangelization.com to find a team near you where you can share the love of Jesus. If there isn't one in your area yet, perhaps God is calling you to start a team in your city. To learn more, visit streetevangelization.com.
Underwritten in part by the following nonprofit.
Are you paying high prices with a traditional health insurance company that pays for things that violate your conscience? There's an alternative available. Solidarity HealthShare is a community of faithful individuals and families that never share into immoral medical services, all while saving you money with prices starting as low as $85 per month for singles and $512 for families. Never fund another abortion with your healthcare dollars. Call 844-313-4999 to learn more.
How does freedom affect our actions? According to the Catholic Catechism, freedom makes us responsible for every act that we have directly willed. Despite her efforts to place all the blame on the serpent, Eve was directly responsible for initiating and committing original sin. She knew God had forbidden her to eat from the tree of good and evil, yet she did it anyway. Cain deliberately killed his brother Abel. King David deliberately committed both adultery and murder. None of the three were ignorant of the gravity of their acts, and there were no mitigating circumstances that diminished their responsibility. However, David was particularly remorseful when confronted with his guilt. The Catechism tells us that the right to the exercise of freedom, especially in moral and religious matters, is an inalienable requirement for the dignity of the human person. This is Peggy Stanton, and this has been the Order of Malta's Minute with the Catechism.
He is honored by the Church as a saint with the title of the Angelic Doctor.
Matthew Bunson and the Doctors of the Church.
St. Thomas Aquinas wrote a basic textbook for young theology students that became the Church's most famous guide to the faith, the Summa Theologica. It helped him earn the title Doctor of the Church. He died in 1274.
For more about the Doctors of the Church, visit doctorsofthechurch.com.
Good afternoon, welcome back. I'm Marcus Peter. My guest is Mary McDonald, Director of the Writing Center and Writing Across the Curriculum program at Cleveland State University. We're talking about what St. Augustine still has to teach us today, particularly from his mature and brilliant and insightful exposition on the Psalms. Mary, we were talking earlier about some of those key insights of maturation as he developed in writing this exposition over 20 years. One thing that he himself writes is that the Psalms pray with us, so to speak. You know, if it prays, we pray. If it laments, you lament. If it exalts, you rejoice. Essentially, he's saying that a prayerful reading of the Psalms is a mirror for our own humanity in relating to God. Would you please expound on that a lot more for us?
Oh, yeah. Yeah, he would also say that the way, and this is from a work by Jason Biasi, the way that Augustine would look at the Psalms would be Jesus speaking to us or God speaking to us. And so when we're exalting or, suffering or lamenting, any of those things in the Psalms, that's very much the experience of Christ. Mm-hmm. And it's very much our entering into that experience. And so he's going to, in other words, when you're reading Augustine, Jason Biasi is going to say, we're going to be very much drawn into the reality of Christ because of the way that Augustine reads those Psalms. Mm-hmm. And so that's a very important thing for us when we approach this text because, again, we're in a culture that has all of these many, many ways of reading. And when we take this way that Augustine wants us to read and allows us to have this experiential kind of reading experience, it's a very powerful thing.
Mary, one of the things that might confound modern readers when it comes to Augustine is we see this picture of him with a quill in his right hand writing, and his heart in his left hand, his eyes on the Holy Spirit, and his heart's on fire. And we get that, but we also don't quite get it. But because Augustine was a man who, as brilliant as he was a man who sought to engage the deepest part of his being in how he, in this case, read the Psalms and thought about human life and God. Just share with us what that looks like.
You're absolutely right, and thank you so much for bringing that up. That is the image for centuries and centuries, and, is him with his heart in his hand on fire. And so that is something that I think we've lost, the appreciation of Augustine as that, like what you just said about him wanting to reach the deepest parts of us. I think that's absolutely right. And his heart on fire is the sense of, and Michael Cameron says he saw in the Psalms a mirror of his own soul. Cameron also points out in another spot, the only thing Augustine was ever interested in was the soul. He said, nothing. That's it. I don't really care about anything else. I'm only interested in the soul. And so when the heart's on fire, I think that's the kind of writer that is trying to reach us at such a deep level, and he's doing it where he was an African writer. So you see a lot of repetition, and you see he's in the role of a bishop, so he's giving a homily. And then the other really fascinating thing is the Psalms at the time he was alive were discussed line by line. In other words, called the commentary. And so that's why the expositions are so long and they're such a strange literary animal.
Right.
And yet each one of those facets allows Augustine in his conversational, repetitious, line-by-line homily to really push out what he wants to say. And I think he does it in this he's a contemplative by the time he's writing. And most contemplatives, if you give them a chance, they will leap from the subject you give them way beyond. And you're somewhere way far beyond that psalm. And so that's a lot of what you see in the expositions is that heart of Augustine is trying to work with the psalm and then jump into helping you.
So there's also an eminently practical reality to the expositions, though. He didn't write them for the sake of a speculative theological exercise to be kept in the academies. He wrote them for his flock as a bishop. He wanted his faithful to come to encounter Jesus in the lines of his writing so that they could encounter Jesus in the lines of the Psalms. Tell us about that.
Absolutely. Totally correct. Yep. Yeah, so he's writing these different things. And I mean, it was fascinating. Even he will stop, like Psalm 68 is a rough one. And even he'll say, okay, that's enough of this one. This one's really hard. Like, in other words, yeah, some of these, some Psalms are very mysterious and very hard. And even Augustine will say, hey, this one was rough. But he's very much trying to all these Psalms to reach us, as like you're saying, to reach us through all these Psalms and to get us to move, to get us to move. It's just amazing.
It's hard for me to imagine that he had any free time, considering just how prolific a bishop he was.
Yes.
And yet he saw the real need for working on this work for 20 years, which again is another thing that we can learn from him, this kind of long-suffering, this virtue of long-suffering when it comes to doing work for the sake of the salvation of souls. Just shed light on that for us.
It's astounding. And when you start reading them, I mean, the first book is rough. It's a rough book to get started with. He really picks it up in the later, second, third, fourth. And I had no idea what I was doing when I was beginning to excerpt these, because I didn't read the scholars on this. I started just reading it. And my friend, who's a Trappist at the Abbey of the Genesee, his name's Brother Augustine Jackson, he was the one who heard this lecture by Brian Daly. He's a Jesuit at Notre Dame, give a lecture on the expositions. And he said to me, these are gathering dust. We have to do something. So I said, okay, sure. So I started reading them. I had no idea what I was doing. And I began to see initially things that would never work for the modern person, like the cattle mean this, and the stars mean this, and the sun. And initially, like Psalm 8, I love Psalm 8. What is man that thou art mindful of him? All these different. No, you don't get what you want. I thought I was going to get an interpretation of the Psalms. No, you're going to get that. So that's what's so fascinating, is that over 20 years, you see him just grow and grow in the depth of this. And then my friend, Brother Augustine, would tell you that the Psalms of Ascent, 120 onward, when it becomes absolutely on fire. So, that's when he's really on. Like, for me, Psalm 128 is just amazing, just goes on and on and on. And I think those are the most coherent passages for the modern reader, would be probably the Psalms 120 and onward. But I think you're right that there's this incredible growth over the volumes, in the sense of his ability to kind of get done what he wants to get done.
Well, Mary, we're out of time in this segment. Just in about 30 seconds or so, how can our listeners start developing an appreciation for what they can learn from Augustine?
Well, one thing is I hope to get a podcast going soon. I've got one started, and I hope it'll be out pretty soon. So the podcast would be a quick way. I hope to take like one moving passage and then just talk about it. Another way would be to go to New City Press and start in on the expositions themselves. The translation is sparkling. It's so beautiful. It's by Maria Bolding. It's from New City Press. And then we have a collection of excerpts. It's called Creation Song. And my friend, Brother Augustine Jackson, he gives reflections on the nature of the wisdom part of this. In other words, as a Trappist, he's more able to explain why it's such a great piece of wisdom literature. And it was found in monasteries all over Europe, and it is one of the key books that fostered Western Christianity. So to me, when people say things like, well, Christians are, how did all this hate end up in Christianity? Well, it didn't start that way. Right. And certainly the expositions, there's a key proof that the love of God and neighbor was absolutely the central message.
Well, thank you so much, Mary. My guest has been Mary McDonald, Director of the Writing Center and Writing Across the Curriculum program at Cleveland State University. As Augustine lay on his deathbed, he asked that Psalm 51 be copied for him. He had them pasted on his wall, and he was so cognizant that he was coming to the end of his days, and he would read this translation and weep. I don't have the time to read everything, but I want to open by saying this. Have mercy on me, O God, according to thy steadfast love. According to thy abundant mercy, blot out my transgressions. Wash me thoroughly from my iniquity, cleanse me from my sin. For I know my transgressions, and my sin is ever before me. Against thee, thee only have I sinned, and done what is evil in thy sight, so that thou art justified in thy sentence, and blameless in thy judgment. This, my friends, is praying the words of Augustine himself. Augustine repeated this psalm until his very last day with tears in his eyes. Let's appreciate this man and learn how to be a better saint from him. Until tomorrow, stay tuned. I'm Marcus Peter.